Look, before we talk about inflation, let me describe a moment you've probably had. You're at a grocery store, or scrolling apartment listings late at night, or checking flight prices for a trip you've been postponing for years. And you pause not because you absolutely can't afford it, but because something feels wrong. You hesitate longer than you used to. You reread the numbers. You start doing little mental calculations you never did a few years ago. You make more money than you did in the past. You've grown professionally. You probably work harder now, not less. On paper, life should feel smoother. But instead, there's this constant background tension. A feeling that every decision now carries more weight. That spending even on normal life things feels like a risk. And that feeling isn't laziness. It's not poor budgeting. It's not a personality flaw. That feeling is inflation working the way it's supposed to. There's something else happening in that moment you don't notice right away. When prices rise slowly, your brain doesn't panic all at once. It adapts, quietly, subtly. You stop asking, is this worth it? And start asking, can I get away with this? You switch brands. You downgrade habits. You call it being smarter with money. But what's actually happening is threshold creep. The line of what feels normal shifts. Your expectations shrink gradually, so gradually you never feel the loss in one sharp moment. This is how inflation avoids resistance. If prices doubled overnight, people would revolt. If prices creep up month after month, people adjust. That adjustment feels personal, but it's systemic. You delay joy. You renegotiate wants. You justify less. And most importantly, you internalize the blame. You think, maybe I shouldn't want this. Maybe I need to work harder. Maybe I'm behind because I made bad choices. Inflation works best when it convinces individuals they are the problem. That's why it doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. Here's the thing most people never hear clearly enough. Inflation isn't simply prices going up. It's a system that rewires behavior. It shapes how you think about time. It changes how you evaluate risk. It quietly trains you to make certain financial decisions faster and others never at all. Once you see that, inflation stops looking like bad luck. It starts looking like design. Now, you've probably heard the usual explanations. Supply chains broke. Companies got greedy. Governments made mistakes. Wars, pandemics, energy shocks. And sure, those things can trigger inflation temporarily. But the inflation that sticks around for decades? The kind that slowly erodes savings, pushes up asset prices, and makes life feel permanently more expensive? That kind of inflation doesn't survive by accident. It survives because the system quietly depends on it. To see why, we have to zoom out and get uncomfortable. Since 1971, when the United States left the gold standard, the US dollar has lost roughly 85% of its purchasing power. That's not a political opinion. That's straight CPI data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Translated into real life, it means this. If your grandparents saved $10,000 in the early 1970s, a serious amount of money at the time, that same cash today buys what roughly $1,300 used to buy. Over a lifetime, savings dissolved. And all of this happened during an era of staggering progress. Computers got cheaper, production got faster, supply chains went global, efficiency exploded. In almost every other era of human history, that level of productivity led to falling prices. So why didn't it this time? Because inflation is not primarily about production. It's about debt. Here's the shift most people never fully process. Modern governments are not funded by taxes. They're funded by borrowing. Taxes help, but they don't cover spending, not even close. Right now, the US government carries over $30 trillion in national debt. Many developed economies sit at or above 100% debt to GDP. That level of debt cannot be repaid conventionally. There isn't enough surplus. There never will be. So instead of paying it back outright, the system does something more subtle. It dilutes it. Inflation reduces the real value of debt every year it exists, not dramatically. Not all at once, quietly. And quietly is the point. If inflation runs at 2%, the real burden of debt shrinks slowly. At 5%, it shrinks much faster. Meanwhile, governments collect taxes in nominal dollars, which rise as prices rise. So even if you feel squeezed, tax revenue often hits record highs. Inflation lightens the debt burden without passing any new laws, without votes, without public backlash. That's why economists call it the invisible tax. It doesn't come with a bill. It doesn't show up on your paycheck. You don't protest it outside Parliament or Congress buildings. You absorb it. And the largest beneficiary of that absorption is always the largest debtor, the state. That isn't ideology. It's arithmetic. Here's why this matters more than most people realize. Debt doesn't just exist at the government level. It layers. Banks lend based on government bonds. Corporations borrow based on bank credit. Consumers borrow based on wages and expectations. Inflation protects this entire stack. If inflation runs below the interest rate on debt, debt becomes heavier over time. If inflation runs above it, debt quietly dissolves. This is why central banks fear deflation far more than inflation. Deflation freezes behavior. Inflation keeps the machine moving, and movement is what credit systems need. This is also why inflation disproportionately benefits those closest to new money creation. When new money enters the system, it doesn't appear evenly. It flows first through governments, financial institutions, large corporations, and asset markets. By the time it reaches wages and prices, purchasing power has already shifted. Economists refer to this pattern as the Cantillon effect, but you don't need to remember the name to feel it. You experience it when rents rise before wages, asset prices surge before income, and costs increase faster than salaries. Inflation doesn't hit everyone at once. It moves like a wave. And most people are standing at the shoreline. Now bring this down to your life. Say you're disciplined. You save diligently. You build up $20,000 years of effort. At 7% inflation levels, many economies have experienced in recent years that savings loses $1,400 of purchasing power every year. You didn't spend it. You didn't waste it. You didn't mismanage it. It just melted. Now think psychologically. What lesson does your brain take from that experience? It learns that patience feels punished. It learns that restraint doesn't feel safe. Now compare that to what inflation teaches when you look at assets. Stock markets rise over long horizons. Real estate prices surge. Anything scarce, land, equities, even speculative assets seems to protect value. Your brain doesn't consciously calculate CPI. It learns emotionally. And the lesson it absorbs is dangerous. Risk feels safer than waiting. Speculation starts to feel rational. This is where inflation stops being economics and becomes psychology. People don't chase trends because they're greedy. They chase because standing still feels like losing ground. That's not an accident. Here's what most people underestimate. Humans do not react to percentages. We react to pressure. And inflation quietly increases 3 kinds of pressure at once. Time pressure, fear of falling behind, and reduced tolerance for long-term planning. When money holds value, people pause. They compare options. They delay gratification. When money loses value, people rush. They rush to invest, rush to buy, rush to borrow, rush to make decisions without full information, and rush people make worse financial choices on average. That benefits transaction-heavy systems, banks, markets, lenders long before it benefits households. A calm population saves carefully. A pressured population moves constantly. Which one do you think modern finance prefers? Now think about how this changes entire consumer culture. When money loses value over time, holding on to it feels irresponsible. Spending feels logical. Borrowing feels necessary. Debt stops feeling dangerous. It starts feeling normal. Entire generations grow up believing debt is just part of life. Student loans become expectation. Car loans become permanent. Credit cards become default bridges between paychecks. And here's the dangerous feedback loop. Inflation makes debt easier to tolerate. Debt makes inflation easier to justify. This is moral hazard at scale. When borrowers expect inflation to reduce future burden, borrowing increases. When lenders expect inflation to raise nominal prices, lending expands. Economic caution is replaced with financial momentum. And momentum feels like growth until it doesn't. But by the time instability emerges, behavior is already locked in. People don't know how to live without leverage anymore. They're not greedy. They're conditioned. Now let's talk about wages, the part where people feel genuinely gaslit. You'll hear headlines saying wages are rising. Women and men earning more than ever. Labor markets tight. All technically true. But truth lives in real terms, not nominal ones. If your salary goes from $60,000 to $66,000, that's a 10% raise. It feels good. But if inflation is running at 8%, your real improvement is thin. Then factor in taxes. Payroll taxes scale. Brackets adjust imperfectly. Benefits get more expensive. After everything, you're running harder just to stand still. This is why so many people say, I earn more than ever, but somehow feel worse. They aren't imagining it. Here's the number that explains everything. Since the late 1970s, U.S. worker productivity rose more than 60%. Median wages, adjusted for inflation, rose about 14%. That difference didn't disappear. It flowed upward into capital, assets, and returns amplified by leverage. Inflation accelerates that separation. It rewards ownership faster than labor ever can. Now you might be thinking, if inflation hurts savers and workers, why not eliminate it completely? Because zero inflation breaks debt-based systems. Modern economies aren't built on cash buffers. They're built on credit, mortgage, corporate loans, student debt, government bonds. If money gained value over time, if deflation ruled, people would hold it. Spending would slow. Loans would default. Debt would collapse. Inflation is the release valve. But the trade-off is rarely stated clearly. System stability is bought at the cost of individual security. The system survives while people adapt. Now, let's talk about the sacred number. 2% inflation. Why 2? Why not 0? Why not 4? Because 2% sounds harmless. It doesn't panic markets. It doesn't outrage voters. It doesn't draw attention. But here's the math no one emphasizes. At 2% inflation, purchasing power halves roughly every 35 years. That is almost exactly the length of a working life. Which means if you rely purely on wages and savings, your economic starting line shifts backward generation by generation unless you actively counter it. That consistency is why inflation is tolerated. It's slow enough to avoid revolt, fast enough to keep money moving. Now let's confront a few objections honestly. Governments are messy. This can't be intentional. True, but systems don't require intent to persist. They require incentives. If a mechanism lowers real debt burdens, increases nominal GDP, boosts tax receipts, supports asset markets, and encourages spending, it will be maintained, even if its side effects hurt quietly. Another objection. Inflation hurts the poor the most. Why would anyone want that? Inflation doesn't hurt everyone equally. Asset owners hedge it. Debtors sometimes benefit from it. Wage earners absorb it. That asymmetry isn't personal. It's structural. Here's the part people usually realize too late. Inflation doesn't just change financial outcomes. It changes life decisions. People delay marriage, delay children, delay career moves, delay entrepreneurship, because risk without buffers feels terrifying. Meanwhile, people with assets can take chances. They can pivot. They can borrow strategically. They can survive mistakes. Inflation widens psychological inequality first. Financial inequality follows. Finally, let's talk about confusion, because confusion keeps the system stable. Inflation is blamed on corporations, politicians, foreign countries, vague economic forces, rarely the structure. Confused people fight each other. Informed people adjust. Meanwhile, inflation quietly transfers purchasing power without confrontation. So what do you actually do? You don't rage at inflation. You don't ignore it. And you don't pretend it'll revert permanently. You reduce exposure. Cash is not a long-term store of value. It's a tool for flexibility. Understand the difference between income and assets. Income feeds you. Assets defend you. Be careful with leverage. Debt only helps if it controls things that inflate faster than the debt itself. Watch lifestyle inflation closely. Every fixed cost locks in future vulnerability. And measure success in purchasing power, not account balances. Ask, what does this money allow me to do now and later? That question forces a different mindset. Instead of asking, how much did I make? You ask, how exposed am I? Instead of asking, can I afford this today? You ask, does this make me more fragile tomorrow? This shift alone puts you ahead of most people. Because inflation punishes people who optimize for comfort, not resilience. Resilience looks boring at first. Lower fixed costs, optionality, liquidity with purpose. Assets that don't demand constant attention. But resilience compounds quietly. And one more thing, this part matters more than spreadsheets. Inflation creates anxiety because it removes certainty. So the most valuable thing you can build isn't wealth first. It's margin, time margin, financial margin, psychological margin. Margin lets you pause when others panic. It lets you wait while others rush. It lets you choose when others react. That is real financial power. Here's the final reframe. Inflation isn't evil. It's revealing. It reveals who understands systems, who plans long-term, who owns things that survive time. Once you see that, the guilt fades. You stop blaming yourself. You stop chasing raises that don't translate. You stop reacting emotionally to every price increase. You start thinking structurally. And once you do that, inflation stops controlling your decisions. If this gave you clarity you never got in school, share it with someone who feels stuck but can't explain why. And if you want more clear, calm breakdowns like this, subscribe. Because money isn't just math. It's psychology. And once you understand both, you stop reacting to inflation. You navigate it.